Did he do it for love? Did he do it because he was drunk on absinthe? And did he really give his ear to a prostitute named Rachel? What's the real story behind Vincent Van Gogh cutting his own ear off? So if you don't know, Vincent Van Gogh was a Dutch painter. He is famous for paintings like Starry Night, his self-portraits, and sunflowers. He was alive from 1853 to 1890, so that kind of gives you an idea of his place in history. And one of the most famous stories about Van Gogh is the fact that he cut his own ear off. So I have done some research. I will tell you that most of my information comes from the book Van Gogh's Ear by Bernadette Murphy. She seemed like the most reliable source, and if you have time, I would definitely check that book out. One thing we know for sure about Van Gogh is that he had some mental health issues. We know they ran in his family, and we know he suffered from them his whole life. A lot of modern doctors have tried to go back and figure out exactly what his diagnosis would be, and there's things from Meniere's disease to bipolar disorder to something brought on by absinthe, but the most reasonable explanation that I found is that he had temporal lobe epilepsy along with either schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So here's the real story, at least as close as we can get 130 years later. For most of his life, Vincent Van Gogh was financially supported by his brother Theo. Now, Van Gogh's dream was to live in kind of an artist's community, and so in 1888, he was living in a small town in France with another painter, Paul Gauguin. Gauguin had been concerned about Van Gogh's mental health, but he had stuck it out and stayed there for a while, but things came to a head on the 23rd of December in 1888. So Gauguin had been kind of saying that he was about to leave the Yellow House, which really upset Van Gogh. And one night Gauguin went out for a walk, and he heard Vincent Van Gogh come up behind him, and when he turned around, Van Gogh had a straight razor in his hand. Now Gauguin looked at him and kind of stared at him, and Van Gogh ran away, but it spooked Gauguin enough that he went to stay in a hotel that night. Well, sometime between that incident and about 11:30 at night, Vincent Van Gogh went back to his home and he cut his ear off. And one of the mysteries has always been, how much did he cut off? And in this book, it becomes pretty clear that he cut most of his ear off. Only a tiny bit of the lobe remained. So he cut his ear off, tried to stop the bleeding, washed his ear up, and then he did package it up and take it to a woman in the red light district. However, she was not a prostitute. Near as we can tell, she was actually a maid in one of the brothels named Gabby. And in this book, it's kind of interesting. Bernadette Murphy points out that Van Gogh throughout his whole life kind of had this religious fervor and did some things that were kind of over the top altruistic. And Gabby had been attacked by a dog when she was younger and had some pretty obvious scars. And Bernadette Murphy's theory is that Van Gogh actually gave her his ear because in this episode he was having, in his brain, giving her his ear would have cured her scars. So that's kind of a crazy, interesting theory. So of course the girls in the brothel called the police. And the police went to Van Gogh's house to investigate, and they found Van Gogh in bed. They actually thought he had died, but luckily they checked a little closer, and he was still alive, but he was suffering very severe blood loss. So they sent Van Gogh to the local hospital where he was treated by an intern of all things, Dr. Felix Ray. But that was actually good luck for Van Gogh because Dr. Ray was new and had actually just learned new bandaging techniques that helped stave off infection a lot better. And without those techniques, Van Gogh very easily could have just died of infection. So Van Gogh stayed in the hospital, having his bandages checked and cleaned and basically just recovering from the blood loss. They obviously didn't have blood transfusions back then. So the cure was to just keep his bandages changed, let him rest, and feed him good food and let his body rebuild the blood supply. He was in the hospital until January 7th, but during that time, he continued to suffer some mental health episodes. And even though he was allowed to return home in January, he was back in the hospital by February, having hallucinations that he was being poisoned. Altogether, he was in and out of the hospital from the end of December to May. And then in May, he decided he was not yet well enough to go home, and he actually opted to go to a private sanatorium in Saint Remy, France. He stayed there for almost a year, did some fantastic work, but still had some mental health episodes while he was there. But in May of 1890, Vincent Van Gogh decided that he was well enough to try to return to the north of France and be closer to his brother. So when he got out of the sanatorium, he did take some time to visit his brother and his sister-in-law and their new baby. He moved to the village of Auvers-sur-Oise, where he tried to carry on and continue painting, but as I said before, Theo was financially supporting him. And after Van Gogh had visited Theo and saw, that Theo had a new baby and a wife and was trying to support them as well, Vincent Van Gogh started to get a lot of anxiety around his financial situation and start to feel like a burden to his brother. And on July 27th, Vincent Van Gogh did shoot himself in the chest. He managed to get back to his lodgings, and Theo was called, so Theo got to be there with him when he passed away 2 days later on the 29th. Weirdly enough, shortly after Van Gogh died, Theo suffered a mental and physical breakdown, and he also moved to an asylum, and he died in January 1891. So 5 months after Vincent died, Theo was also gone. And then in 1914, Theo's widow, Jo, actually had Theo and Vincent moved and buried together so that they could be together in death as close as they were in life. So, terribly sad story, but that's as close as we can get to what really happened now 130 years later. If you like the story and want to hear more history, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.